In the heart of the American Old West, Dry Creek seemed like the last place anyone would find trouble. Quiet, peaceful, and forgotten by time, the town was home to Reuben Hale, a mild-mannered barber with a grizzled face and weathered hands. No one knew his past, and most didn't ask. But when a band of notorious outlaws targets his shop, they're about to learn a deadly lesson. Reuben Hale is no ordinary man. A retired gunslinger, his quiet life was built on a past that the bandits will soon regret awakening. What follows will shake Dry Creek to its core and tear down a criminal empire no one saw coming. Before we dive back into the story, let us know where you're tuning in from. If you're enjoying this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because tomorrow we've got an exciting story you won't want to miss. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across Dry Creek as the day wound to a close. The small town, with its dirt roads and simple wooden buildings, seemed content in its quiet anonymity. Reuben Hale sat alone in his barbershop, the faint scent of aftershave lingering in the air as he methodically cleaned his tools. His hands moved with practiced precision, snapping the razor blade into its holder, cleaning the clippers, wiping down the countertop. He hadn't felt the rush of excitement or danger in years, and truth be told, he was content with that. Hale had long since traded in his six-shooter for a straight razor, the violence of his past life a distant memory. He had earned his peace, and Dry Creek had become his sanctuary. The locals saw him as just another old man, his face worn and his hair salt and pepper gray. They didn't know, nor did they care, that Hale had once been one of the fastest guns in the West. That was a lifetime ago, a different life, but on that particular evening, the air in the barbershop felt heavier than usual. There was something in the way the wind howled through the cracks in the window panes, something in the silence that spoke of danger. Reuben's gut twisted, a feeling he hadn't had in years. He wiped his hands on a rag, staring out the window, into the dimming light, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. It wasn't until the doorbell above his shop's door jingled, signaling the arrival of customers, that the quiet was broken. The men who walked in were strangers to Reuben, three rough-looking figures with hats low over their eyes and boots caked in dirt. Their clothes were mismatched, but the way they carried themselves spoke of a life spent on the wrong side of the law. Reuben didn't need to ask who they were. Word traveled fast in towns like Dry Creek, and these men had the unmistakable aura of outlaws. His gut tightened again, and this time he couldn't ignore the sense of danger creeping over him. "Evening," Reuben said, his voice steady but measured. He reached for his towel, wiping his hands once more. "What can I do for you, fine gentlemen?" The leader of the trio, a burly man with a thick beard and cold eyes, smirked. "Just a trim? Old man, you run a barber shop, don't you? Thought we'd give you a visit." Reuben nodded slowly, his mind racing. There was something off about the way the man spoke, too casual, like this was all some kind of game to him, and the others flanked him with the same menacing energy, eyes darting to the door, the windows, the shadows in the corners of the shop. Reuben's gaze lingered on them for a moment, reading their body language. He knew the signs all too well. These men weren't here for a simple shave and a haircut. They were here for something else. "Well, you've come to the right place, I reckon," Reuben said, his tone light, but his hand subtly brushing against the edge of the countertop where his old rusted revolver lay hidden beneath a layer of dust. It wasn't much these days, but it had served him well in his younger years. The leader of the group stepped closer, and the other two fanned out, their eyes scanning the room. "You might have heard of us?" The man grinned, pulling out a chair and sitting down. "We're the Black River Gang. You know, the kind of folks who make sure towns like this one stay in line." Reuben's eyes didn't betray him. He knew the Black River Gang. They'd left a trail of bloodshed across the West. The thought of his past life stirred uncomfortably in his chest. But he didn't react, didn't let his emotions show. "I'm afraid I don't know you fellas," Reuben said, keeping his voice steady. "But if you're looking for a haircut, I'm happy to oblige. Take a seat." The man scowled, not pleased with the old man's calm demeanor. "You think you're clever, huh? I reckon you haven't heard of what we do to places like this. We take what we want, old man, and right now we want to make sure this town pays its dues. You wouldn't want to find yourself in the way, would you?" There it was, the thinly veiled threat. Reuben's fingers flexed, his knuckles brushing the familiar weight of his gun. "I don't want any trouble," Reuben said, his voice colder now as his eyes locked with the man's. "But you're in the wrong place." The leader chuckled darkly, but Reuben's mind was already working, calculating his next move. He'd lived a life full of gunfights and bloodshed, but those days were long gone. He was no longer the young man who'd built a reputation with his quick draw and steady aim. Still, there was something about the way these men carried themselves, arrogant, presumptuous, that brought a fire back to his gut. "Why don't you just sit down?" Reuben suggested again, his tone deceptively calm, "and I'll make you a deal." The man leaned forward, intrigued. "A deal, huh? What kind of deal?" Reuben's eyes narrowed. "You leave this town alone, and I won't have to remind you why it's a bad idea to cross me." The leader laughed, the sound echoing through the small room. "You're a funny old man, but I think you'll find that you're outmatched here." With that, the bandits made their move, not realizing they'd just crossed a line they would soon regret. The tension in the room grew thick as the bandit leader's laughter faded into an ominous silence. Reuben could feel the heat rising in. His chest, his body, instinctively slipping back into a rhythm long forgotten. The air in the barber shop now seemed to hum with the weight of something about to happen. His hand moved ever so slightly toward the edge of the counter, brushing the old revolver, the cold steel a reminder of the man he used to be. But it wasn't just the gun that gave him confidence. It was the knowledge of the life he'd lived, and the lessons learned over decades of facing down men who thought they could intimidate him. He'd faced down worse than these fools. The leader's expression faltered for a split second. He clearly didn't expect the old man to stand his ground. His fingers twitched, and Reuben could almost hear the thought process running through his mind. This wasn't supposed to be difficult. This was supposed to be a simple shakedown, a quick terrorization of a defenseless barber in a sleepy town. Instead, they had stumbled onto something far more dangerous than they realized. The second man, a lean figure with a scar running down his cheek, reached for his gun. Reuben's eyes flicked toward the movement, his instincts sharpening, but he didn't act immediately. There was no need to rush. The game had already shifted, and the rules had changed. He waited. Let the man make the first move. The lean bandit drew his pistol, but before he could raise it to aim, Reuben's hand moved with the swiftness of a rattlesnake strike. In a blur, he grabbed the revolver from under the counter, his thumb flicking the hammer back as he stood, drawing in a single, fluid motion. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the small space, and the lean bandit's body jerked backward. As the bullet tore through his chest, the force of the impact sent him crashing to the ground, his pistol slipping from his hand. The room was suddenly filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder, and the sharpness of the moment seemed to stretch time itself. The other two men froze. For a long moment, they didn't move, their faces masks of disbelief. The leader blinked, his eyes narrowing as he realized that the old man had just shot his partner dead with a single precise shot. Reuben's hand didn't shake. He didn't even flinch. His eyes were calm, focused, like the still surface of a pond before a storm. He took a slow step forward, his gun still leveled at the leader's chest. "Now," Reuben said, his voice low but firm, "I'm going to make this very simple for you. You leave this town right now. You don't rob anyone. You don't burn anyone's house down. You don't even look sideways at anyone who lives here. And you get out right now without another word." The bandit leader's hand hovered near his holster, the slightest tremor betraying his confidence. But he hesitated, not sure whether to draw or to think. He couldn't take Reuben down, not with a gun already in his face and no hope of outdrawing. Him, the older man, had been faster, sharper, and far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. What the hell are you?" the leader stammered, his voice quivering with uncertainty. Reuben didn't answer immediately. He let the silence hang between them, his cold, steely eyes never leaving the leader's face. His mind raced, processing the situation. He hadn't expected to kill the man so quickly, but he couldn't let him or the other bandits leave alive. There were far too many outlaws like them in the West, and Reuben had seen firsthand the kind of havoc they wreaked. This town might not have been his concern, but he would make it his concern if it meant wiping out one more criminal organization. The bandit leader licked his lips, his face growing pale as he assessed his options. He knew he was outmatched. Still, the survival instinct kicked in. "We'll kill you for this, old man," he spat, reaching for his gun. Reuben's finger tightened on the trigger before the leader even had the chance to finish the sentence. The shot rang out again, and the leader crumpled to the floor with a heavy thud, the smell of blood filling the room. The second bandit, one, who had been standing frozen in place, watching the chaos unfold, finally snapped out of his stupor. His hand shot up, his gun drawn. But by the time his hand was level with Reuben's chest, the old man's revolver was already back in his grip, its barrel pointing directly at the bandit's head. Reuben didn't even blink. He didn't need. To one quick, brutal squeeze of the trigger, and the bandit fell backward, his body twitching in the final throes of death. Reuben stood still, his gun still raised, the smoke curling lazily around him. It had all happened so quickly. 3 men, 3 gunshots, and just as quickly it was over. His chest heaved as the adrenaline began to fade, but his mind was already shifting gears. The small barber shop, which had once been a peaceful haven, was now a battlefield. The bodies of the bandits lay scattered across the floor, but Reuben's focus was sharp as ever. He wasn't finished. From the back of the shop, a low voice called out, "Reuben?" It was Mrs. Reynolds, the widow who had been dropping off her husband's shaving kit earlier that day. She had only just made it to the back door when the gunshots had started. Reuben's heart skipped a beat, but he quickly wiped the sweat from his brow and holstered his gun. "Stay inside, Mrs. Reynolds," he called out, his voice steady but urgent. "You don't need to see this." Her feet shuffled on the floorboards, the sound of her approach clearly hesitant. "I heard shots. What happened, Reuben? Who were those men?" Reuben paused. For a moment, the weight of what he had just done hung heavy on him. He had acted without hesitation, without mercy, and now there would be consequences. There always were. But for the moment, Dry Creek was safe, and as the door opened slowly, and Mrs. Reynolds stepped in, her face wide-eyed with worry, Reuben Hale was already thinking ahead. He had killed those men in self-defense, but that wouldn't be enough to keep the law off his back, and it certainly wouldn't stop the far-reaching grip of the Black River Gang. He hadn't just killed 3 bandits. He had sent a message, and now someone was going to come looking for him. The room felt unnaturally quiet as Mrs. Reynolds slowly took in the scene. Her wide eyes scanned the bodies of the bandits, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't expected this. Nobody in Dry Creek had. Reuben had kept to himself for years, his past buried beneath a veil of routine and silence, and now that past had come crashing back into the present in a way no one could ignore. "Reuben," Mrs. Reynolds breathed, her voice trembling. What happened here? Those men?" Reuben took a step toward her, his boots making a soft scuffing sound against the wooden floor. His expression softened, but only just. He didn't want her to be afraid, but he couldn't lie to her either. "Don't worry about it, Mrs. Reynolds. It's taken care of," he said, his voice calm, almost soothing. But inside, his mind was working a mile a minute. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The Black River Gang didn't operate on the basis of one failed attempt. They were vicious, and they would return. He knew it. The widow looked at him, unsure whether to be relieved or horrified. She took a step back, still trying to process what she was seeing. You killed them, Reuben, right here in your shop." Reuben nodded, but his eyes never left the door. "Yes, they won't bother this town anymore, but you need to go inside and lock the door behind you. This town's not safe anymore." Her mouth opened to speak, but before she could utter another word, the sound of horses galloping outside broke through the tense air. The rhythmic pounding of hooves grew louder and louder, a warning Reuben couldn't ignore. He knew who it was, even before the first shout reached his ears. The Black River Gang wasn't done yet. "Go inside," he repeated, his tone sharp this time. "Lock the door, and don't come out until I say it's clear." Mrs. Reynolds didn't argue. She glanced once more at the bodies on the floor before retreating into the back of the shop. Reuben didn't waste another second. He moved with the same practiced grace that had kept him alive all those years ago. His mind already racing through the plan. The back door creaked open just as the first rider appeared in the street. Reuben ducked low behind the counter, his hand reaching under for his revolver. He had hoped for a little more time, but the outlaws were always quick to respond, always ruthless. A man rode into the square, a tall figure with a dark hat that shaded his face. His horse came to a skidding stop in front of the barber's shop, and with a jerk of his reins he dismounted. The man wasn't alone. Several more riders emerged from the shadows, each one taking up positions in the town square. They were here, and they weren't leaving without a fight. Reuben's hand tightened around his gun. His muscles were already oiled, his senses heightened. There was no room for hesitation now. The storm had come to Dry Creek, and he was the only one who could stand between it and the people he'd sworn to protect, even if it was just by keeping the town from falling. To the likes of men like these, the leader, the same bearded man from earlier, strode forward. His eyes gleamed with fury, and his mouth twisted into a snarl as he reached the door to the shop. "I knew you weren't just some old fool," the leader said, his voice laced with venom. "But you'll regret crossing us. We own this land. We own this town. He stopped as he pushed the door open, stepping over the threshold and into the dim light of the shop. Reuben's eyes locked on his, steady and calm. The gun in his hand was still trained on the man, but he didn't fire, not yet. He wanted the leader to see him, to understand that this wasn't a fight he was going to win. "You're too late," Reuben said, his voice cold, even as his heartbeat began to race. "You should have left when you had the chance." The leader's hand moved toward his holster, but before he could even begin to pull his weapon, Reuben's gun was already in motion. The revolver roared, and the leader's body jerked back, a look of shock frozen on his face. The bullet had found its mark, but the leader remained standing for a moment, just long enough for Reuben to see the realization in his eyes. This was the last mistake he would ever make. Before the leader crumpled to the ground, one of the other outlaws let out a loud curse and reached for his own gun. But Reuben was quicker. Another shot rang out, and the outlaw fell to the ground, clutching his chest. His partner had no time to react before Reuben's revolver found him too. The last man, young and wiry, stood frozen, his face pale with fear. Reuben's eyes locked on him for a long, tense moment, and the young outlaw's hand wavered over his holstered gun. But it was too late. The final shot echoed through the shop. Reuben let out a slow breath, his heart still pounding in his chest. He'd acted fast, he'd acted decisively, but something gnawed at the back of his mind. He wasn't done with the Black River Gang, not by a long shot. There was still their leader to deal with. As the last man slumped to the ground, Reuben holstered his revolver, his eyes scanning the bodies around him. He hadn't wanted to kill them, but they had given him no choice. There was no other way to protect this town, no other way to stop the tide of crime that was pushing across the west. But the Black River gang was far from finished, and Reuben Hale knew deep down that he hadn't killed the last of them. The real battle was yet to come. Reuben didn't linger over the bodies. He knew the Black River gang wouldn't be deterred by a few fallen men. They were too entrenched, too brutal, and their reach was far wider than he'd ever anticipated. His mind worked quickly, piecing together the threads of what was happening. Dry Creek was no longer the sleepy town it once was. It had become a target, a small, vulnerable piece of land for the gang to take, exploit, and strip of its last ounce of life. Reuben had learned long ago that the West wasn't a place for men who hesitated. It was a place where you either moved fast or you didn't move at all. The sound of boots on the porch made him freeze. Another wave of riders? Was it the sheriff or someone from the town come to check on the chaos? Reuben's hand went instinctively to his revolver again, but as the door creaked open, it wasn't another gang member who walked in. It was someone he hadn't expected, someone he never thought he'd see again. "You look like hell," the voice drawled, its familiarity cutting through the tension in the air. Reuben's breath caught in his throat, and his hand momentarily stilled over the revolver's grip. He turned slowly, eyes narrowing as the figure stepped into the dim light of the barber shop. The man was tall and wiry, with the same weathered expression Reuben had seen 1,000 times in men he once rode with. His face was lined with the scars of battles long fought, and his eyes, sharp as ever, met Reuben's without a flicker of hesitation. "Jackson," Reuben said quietly, his voice betraying none of the shock that had hit him. He had last seen Jackson Carter in the unforgiving deserts of Arizona over a decade ago. They had parted ways after a bloody confrontation, each man going down different paths. But now, here he was, standing in the very shop where Reuben had hoped to escape the past. Jackson gave a grim smile, his hands resting casually on the worn handles of his holsters. "Figured I'd find you here. You've always been good at hiding, old friend." Reuben's eyes scanned Jackson quickly. He hadn't changed much, still wearing the same dusty coat and boots that Reuben remembered, but something was different now. There was a hardness to his gaze, something far colder than before. Jackson had been one of the best gunfighters Reuben had ever known, but after all these years, who knew what side he was on? Reuben kept his voice steady. "What are you doing here, Jackson?" Jackson's lips twisted into a wry grin as he looked at the bodies scattered across the floor. "I was just going to ask you the same thing, Reuben. It seems like you've stirred up a hornet's nest. The Black River gang doesn't take kindly to being crossed." Reuben didn't flinch, though his pulse quickened. He had hoped to avoid this, to keep his past buried. But the gang's appearance in Dry Creek had changed everything. If Jackson was here, then that could only mean one thing. Jackson had his own score to settle with the Black River gang, or worse, he was working for them. "You don't have to get involved, Jackson," Reuben said carefully. "This isn't your fight." Jackson laughed softly, the sound dark and hollow. "Oh, it's always been my fight. You just forgot that." He took a step closer, his boots scraping on the floor as his eyes never left Reuben's face. "But this town, it's got something. The Black River gang wants, and it's gonna cost you. This place won't be safe for long, Reuben. Not with all the men they've got looking for revenge." Reuben's mind spun as he tried to read Jackson. He wasn't sure where Jackson's allegiances lay, but he knew one thing for sure. He didn't trust him. Not yet. Not after all the years that had passed. "If you've come here to warn me, then I'm listening," Reuben said, his tone hardening. "But I don't need anyone else's help. I've handled this town's problems on my own for years, and I'm not about to. Let a group of bandits take it from me now." Jackson's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment Reuben saw a flash of the man he'd known in the past, the one who wouldn't back down from a fight, no matter how hopeless it seemed. Jackson was a survivor, just like him. But there was something in his eyes now that made Reuben uneasy, something that hinted at betrayal. "Look, I don't care about the town," Jackson said, his voice quieter now. "I've got my own reasons for coming back to Dry Creek, but the Black River Gang, they'll burn this place to the ground if they have to. And if you don't want to see that happen, you're gonna need more than a gun and a few empty threats. You're gonna need help." Reuben considered Jackson's words for a long moment. He could feel the weight of the decision hanging on him, the knowledge that anything he did now would shape the rest of his life. If he accepted Jackson's help, he might gain an ally, but he also might be dragging a snake into his home. If Jackson was working for the Black River Gang, then all he was doing now was setting Reuben up for a fall. But there was no time to dwell on what-ifs. Reuben knew his back was against the wall. The gang wasn't going to stop, and they certainly weren't going to forgive him for what he'd done. "I don't trust you, Jackson," Reuben said, his voice low. "But I don't have a choice, do I?" Jackson's grin returned, this time with a hint of something more genuine. "Not unless you want to die alone, old friend." Before Reuben could respond, the door to the shop slammed open once more, and another rider strode in, this one dressed in black, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He stepped in without a word, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. The Black River Gang had sent someone else, and this time it was no ordinary thug. Reuben's heart skipped a beat. He knew this man, and he was the one Reuben had been dreading. The man's voice cut through the silence, thick with menace. "Reuben Hale, I thought you might be hiding. I'm here to bring you in, or bury you." Reuben's hand moved instinctively to his revolver, but Jackson was already stepping forward, his own weapon drawn and leveled at the newcomer. "Not so fast," Jackson said, his voice dripping with tension. "We've got unfinished business, all of us." The air in the shop grew thick as the standoff began, and Reuben knew the real fight had just begun. The tension in the barbershop was suffocating. The newcomer, dressed in black and draped in a long coat that seemed to swallow the dim light of the room, had stepped in with the same confidence that a lion would stride into the den of a wounded beast. His hands rested calmly on his holstered pistols, the faint glint of metal visible beneath the edges of his coat. He was tall, lean, and moved with the predator's grace that Reuben had seen in men who knew they were the deadliest thing in the room. Jackson didn't flinch. His revolver was still aimed directly at the man in black, but his eyes flickered between him and Reuben, sizing up the situation. Reuben's grip on his own gun tightened, the weight of the revolver familiar in his hand, but it didn't bring the comfort it once had. The past was coming back, faster than he could outrun it. "You've got guts, stepping into my town like this," Reuben said, his voice low and deliberate, but it carried a weight of authority that had been earned over years of surviving gunfights. The man in black chuckled, the sound cold and humorless. "You've got a lot of nerve, Hale, killing 3 of my men. You've got no idea what you've started." Reuben's eyes locked with Jackson's. The stranger wasn't here just to deliver a message. He was here to finish what had been started. The Black River Gang had its hooks deep into the West, and now they were coming to reclaim their reputation and power. Jackson's gun never wavered, but his eyes were calculating, assessing the man before him. Reuben's mind was already working through the possibilities. There was something different about this man, something that suggested he wasn't just another hired gun. The way he carried himself, the confidence, the ease with which he had entered the barbershop, it all pointed to one thing. This was the leader of the Black River Gang. "I don't have time for a standoff, Hale," the man said, his eyes narrowing. "You've killed my men. Now you've got 2 choices, surrender and face what's coming for you, or you die in this very shop, just like the others." Reuben's breath came slow, steady. The past few moments had unfolded too quickly for his liking, but it was too late to retreat. He'd already made his choice when he pulled the trigger on the first bandit. And now, with the Black River Gang's leader standing in front of him, there was no turning back. "You're right about one thing," Reuben said, his voice cool, his fingers resting lightly on the grip of his revolver. "I've killed your men, and if you're thinking I'm going to go quietly, you're gravely mistaken." Jackson didn't say a word. His eyes were locked on the man in black, his posture relaxed, but his hand steady. There was no telling which way Jackson would move, if he was truly on Reuben's side, or if he was just biding his time. But Reuben didn't have the luxury of doubting him now. He couldn't afford to. There was no room for hesitation, not when it was life or death. The man in black's lip curled into a sneer. "It's a shame you won't just lay down and make this easy, old man. I'd rather not waste time killing you, but if that's the way it's gotta be." The first movement came fast, quicker than Reuben had anticipated. The man in black's hand shot out to grab his gun, but Reuben was already a step ahead. The familiar weight of his revolver was lifted before the Black River gang leader could even clear his holster. Reuben's shot rang out, cutting through the silence of the barbershop like a thunderclap. The bullet struck the man in black in the shoulder, sending him stumbling back. The man grunted but didn't fall. He was quick, far quicker than most men, and he recovered faster than Reuben expected. Jackson fired as well. His shot came in from the side, striking the man in black's leg, forcing him to kneel briefly. The leader hissed in pain, but the fire in his eyes burned even hotter. He wasn't done. "You're quick, Hale," the man snarled, wiping the blood from his shoulder, "but not quick enough." The man's hand was a blur as he pulled his gun from the holster, aiming at Reuben with the speed of a rattlesnake strike. But Jackson wasn't waiting anymore. With a flash of movement, he stepped forward, his gun aimed straight at the man in black's head. "Not today," Jackson growled, his fingers squeezing the trigger. The shot echoed, but it didn't find its mark. The man in black, with a predatory grin, swayed slightly, and then he dove behind the counter, using it as cover as he returned fire. The exchange of gunshots rang out, the noise deafening in the small space. The crack of gunfire followed by the sharp scent of gunpowder. Reuben ducked, his heart hammering in his chest. He moved swiftly to the side, crouching low as he fired. Another shot aiming for the man's head, but the leader was already rolling behind the counter, out of sight. "I won't let you destroy this town," Reuben called out, his voice steady, though his breath came in quick bursts. His body was still ready for the fight, but his mind raced with possibilities. The man in black had the advantage of position now. He'd chosen the right cover, and Reuben and Jackson were exposed. Jackson's voice was tight, edged with frustration. "We need to move, Reuben. This place isn't built for this kind of fight. We need to draw him out, or we'll end up pinned. Here all night." Reuben glanced over at Jackson. There was no time to think about it. They had to end this. Now. With a single, synchronized movement, Reuben and Jackson broke from their cover. Jackson moved to the left, firing a quick, calculated shot to distract the man in black, while Reuben slid to the right, using the opportunity to circle around. They were working together now, two old gunslingers with a shared goal, to end the reign of the Black River Gang. Reuben took a deep breath, adjusting his grip on his revolver. He could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on him. This was the fight he had avoided for so long, but now there was no choice. He was either going to end it or be consumed by it. He stepped forward, his boots quiet against the floorboards. He knew what had to be done. The final showdown was upon them. The barbershop felt like a battlefield, each movement stretched out in agonizing slow motion. The smell of gunpowder and blood lingered in the air, mixing with the heat of tension that weighed heavily on Reuben's chest. He could hear his heartbeat thundering in his ears, but his mind was razor-sharp, every sense heightened, every thought calculated. The Black River Gang's leader was still behind cover, but Reuben knew that if they didn't act fast, this small shop could turn into a tomb. He was no stranger to high-stakes gunfights. But this was different. This wasn't just about survival. It was about reclaiming something much deeper. The town, his own peace, the life he had built after years of violence and bloodshed. The last thing he ever wanted was to be pulled back into the chaos. But now, with the Black River Gang at his door, there was no turning back. Jackson had already moved, darting to the left, his boots barely making a sound on the wooden floor. He had his revolver in hand, moving with the same practiced ease Reuben remembered from their younger days. The two of them, old gunslingers, had survived countless battles together. But that was before the passage of time and the scars it left behind. Jackson was no longer the same man Reuben once knew. He was a ghost, just like Reuben had been for the last few years, drifting through life, keeping to the shadows. But now, they were fighting together again. A familiar feeling stirred in Reuben's gut. Trust. It wasn't easy, but they had no choice. Reuben watched Jackson's movement out of the corner of his eye as he crouched behind the counter, just inches from the leader's position. The man in black was still shooting at them, trying to pin them down. His movements were deliberate, calculating, but there was something Reuben had learned over the years. Men like the leader, ruthless, fast, and hungry for power, tended to underestimate the people they thought they had cornered, and that was his advantage. He didn't hesitate. Moving like a shadow, Reuben slipped around the back of the counter, the soft creak of the floorboards drowned by the sound of gunfire. He was nearly there when the man in black's voice cut through the chaos. "You don't have to do this, Hale," the leader growled, his voice low but menacing. "You've already killed 3 of my men. You've made your point. Just walk away and I'll let you live." Reuben didn't even flinch at the offer. He knew better than to trust the words of a man who had already shown his hand. The Black River Gang didn't bargain. They took, they destroyed, and now Reuben knew they had crossed the line one too many times. "I'm not walking away," Reuben said flatly, his voice cool, cold even, as he rounded the corner and came face to face with the Black River Gang's leader. "You're not leaving here alive." The man's face twisted into a vicious grin. "Then you'll die trying." Before the leader could draw his gun, Reuben moved. It was a blur of motion, too fast for the human eye to follow. His revolver snapped up, his finger already pulling the trigger. But just before the shot rang out, Jackson's voice cut through the din, his gun coming up with a flash of steel. "Not today, partner." In that instant, the sound of 2 shots, the loud crack of Reuben's revolver, and the sharp bark of Jackson's, punctuated the air. The man in black let out a strangled gasp as the bullets tore into him, one hitting his side, the other grazing his temple. He staggered back, clutching his wound, eyes wide with shock and disbelief. He fell to the ground with a heavy thud, his body twitching as his life drained away. For a long moment, everything was still. The silence after the gunshots was almost deafening. The only sound left was the faint hiss of the man in black's breath as he tried to speak, but words failed him. His eyes locked with Reuben's, a silent question in them. Why? Reuben stepped forward, his boots heavy against the floor, the weight of his decision settling into his bones. He didn't need to answer the question. The man had made his choice. He'd chosen violence, and Reuben had followed suit. The Black River Gang was gone, but its legacy wouldn't fade so easily. Reuben looked at Jackson, his face unreadable. Jackson nodded once, his expression dark. There was no victory in their eyes, no joy. Just the grim acknowledgement that this fight, like all others, had cost them something they would never get back. "Is it over?" Jackson asked, his voice quieter now. Reuben stood still for a moment, watching the lifeless body of the Black River Gang's leader, the man who had been the threat, the cause of all this violence. Slowly he holstered his revolver, his fingers tightening around the grip, almost as if he didn't want to let go. But he did. "It's over for now," Reuben said, his voice low. But the Black River Gang was just one part of the bigger picture. They've got allies, connections. You don't just wipe out a gang like that and walk away. Jackson's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Yeah, I know, but we've got time. For now, the town's safe. Reuben nodded, but his mind was already moving ahead. There would be questions to answer, lawmen to deal with, and more threats to eliminate. The gang might be finished here, but there were always others, always more. You said you had your reasons for coming back, Jackson, Reuben said, turning toward the door. What was it? What are you really after? Jackson hesitated for a moment, then spoke, his tone heavy with the weight of his past. I'm looking for redemption, Reuben. Same as you. I'm not proud of what I've done, but I'm not going to let men like that tear down every town they come across. You're right about one thing. They're not the only ones. There are more out there, and I'm not going to sit back and watch them burn everything down. Reuben's gaze hardened. You've got a long road ahead, Jackson. It's not easy, walking away from the kind of life we've lived, but if you're in this fight with me, then we fight it together. Jackson gave a slight nod, his eyes steely. I'm with you. For what it's worth, I'm on your side. Reuben didn't respond right away. The weight of those words hung in the air. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a start. As the dust settled outside and the sound of hooves slowly faded into the distance, Reuben knew the fight wasn't over. It had only just begun, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't fighting alone. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty streets of Dry Creek. The faint, cool breeze that swept through the town did little to shake the heavy silence that had settled over the place. The town was still, too still. Reuben could feel the weight of every passing moment, the heavy anticipation of what would come next. The Black River Gang was finished for now, but as always in the West, there were more out there just waiting for the right moment to strike. Inside the barbershop, Reuben cleaned his gun slowly, methodically, as he let his thoughts wander. His mind wasn't on the gun, though. It wasn't on the bloodstains that still marred the floor or the bodies of the men who had come into his shop to die. No, his thoughts were on the future. What would happen now that the gang had been wiped out, and what came next for him and the town of Dry Creek? Jackson had taken a seat in one of the old chairs, watching Reuben in silence, his hands resting loosely on his knees. Neither of them said anything for a while, the kind of silence that lingered between old friends, or perhaps old enemies, depending on how you looked at it, was thick and unspoken. Reuben knew Jackson well enough by now to understand that he wasn't here for a simple reunion. Jackson had been carrying something with him for a long time, and Reuben could feel it. It wasn't the first time they had found themselves in a firefight together, but this was different. There was a sense of finality in the air, something that had shifted the moment the leader of the Black River Gang had fallen. The world they had known, filled with danger, uncertainty, and violence, was slipping away, and they were left holding the remnants of a life that neither of them could fully walk away from. Jackson broke the silence, his voice rough from the gunfire. You think it's over, Reuben? Reuben didn't look up from his revolver, his fingers running over the smooth wood of the handle as he thought carefully about his response. It's over for Dry Creek, at least for now. But like I told you earlier, the Black River Gang isn't the only one. They were just a piece of a much bigger puzzle. Jackson leaned back in the chair, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the grim determination in Reuben's voice. You've been saying that for years, ever since I left, he said, his tone quieter now. That there's always another gang, always another war to fight. But you never told me why you keep fighting, why you never left it behind. Reuben stopped what he was doing and looked up, locking eyes with Jackson. His gaze was steady, his expression unreadable, but behind it was the truth, the unspoken reason that had driven him to keep fighting all these years. You know why, Jackson, Reuben said softly. You and I both know that out here there's always something to fight for. A town, a person, your own survival. It's never really over, no matter how much we want it to be. Jackson looked away, his jaw tightening as the weight of Reuben's words settled in. Reuben could see the shift in him, the conflict that still tore at him from within. Jackson's past was as riddled with bloodshed as his own, and just like Reuben, he couldn't outrun it. "Well, we've got to start somewhere," Jackson said, his voice firming. "If we want to see the end of it, then we've got to push back, not just fight for ourselves, but fight for everyone else who's caught in this mess. And Dry Creek, it's the first step." Reuben stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the town as the light continued to fade. In the distance, he could see the faint outline of the hills that surrounded Dry Creek. A sense of calm washed over him for a brief moment, only to be replaced by the harsh reminder that nothing stayed calm for long. "Dry Creek won't be the last town," Reuben said, his voice almost to himself. "But it could be the one where we make our stand. We've got a shot at it. But it won't be easy, and it won't be without sacrifice." Jackson didn't argue. He simply nodded, his gaze distant as he, too, understood what Reuben was saying. The Black River Gang might have been the most recent threat, but it was far from the last. And Reuben was right. They couldn't rest. "Not now. What do we do next?" Jackson asked, rising from the chair, his hand once again instinctively resting on the grip of his gun. Reuben turned to face him, his expression grim but determined. "We finish what we started. We clean up Dry Creek, and then we deal with whatever's out there. There's no room for hesitation anymore, not for me and not for you." Jackson's lips curled into a slight smile, but it was devoid of warmth. "Guess I never really got out of this life, did I?" Reuben gave a small, humorless chuckle. "No one ever does. Not really." Jackson's expression hardened, and Reuben saw the flicker of something else, something deeper, darker, pass through his eyes. There was no denying it. The years had left their mark on both of them. Reuben had done his best to keep his past buried. Jackson had spent his life running from his. But now they had both crossed paths once more, caught in the tide of something much bigger than either of them. "We've got work to do," Reuben said, his voice firm. "But we'll do it right. We'll make sure that Dry Creek stays safe. And if we can clean up this mess, maybe we can get out of this life for good." Jackson's eyes flicked to the window, where the last rays of sunlight were beginning to fade into night. The weight of the promise hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Reuben thought he saw the faintest flicker of hope in Jackson's expression. But it disappeared as quickly as it had come. Hope was a fleeting thing in the West. With one final glance at the bodies on the floor, Reuben turned toward the door, his hand already resting on the doorknob. Jackson followed him, the two of them walking side by side, not as allies or enemies, but as two men who had been shaped by the harsh, unforgiving land they called home. As they stepped outside, the cold night air greeted them, and the first stars of evening began to shine in the vast sky above. The darkness was closing in, but for Reuben Hale and Jackson Carter, the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The air in Dry Creek felt different as Reuben and Jackson stepped outside, the town now bathed in the dim amber light of dusk. The streets were quieter than usual, the usual sounds of horses trotting and distant chatter silenced by the violence that had just unfolded. The wind picked up, carrying the dust of the town and the remnants of gunpowder through the streets. For a moment, everything seemed still, too still. But Reuben knew that peace, even if it lasted for a moment, was an illusion. The Black River Gang's presence had already shattered whatever fragile calm existed. The two men walked toward the heart of the town, their boots crunching against the dry ground. Jackson kept his distance, not out of suspicion, but because he knew what Reuben was thinking. There were things that needed to be done now, choices that would shape the town's future. Reuben's mind was already working through the options. They reached the town's small saloon, a wooden structure that had seen better days. It wasn't much to look at, worn down by years of use and neglect, but it was the center of Dry Creek's social life. The flickering light of a lantern inside gave the place a strange warmth, in contrast to the chill of the evening air. Reuben could feel the eyes on him as he approached. The people were watching. They always watched after something like this. They had seen the violence, the bloodshed, and they had seen Reuben Hale, once a young, feared gunslinger, walk into the saloon as a savior. But what they didn't know was that he wasn't just a man of the past anymore. He was a man who had fought wars, buried ghosts, and survived. The wreckage of his own choices. Reuben wasn't sure he could ever fully escape the violence that had defined his youth. Inside the saloon, a few patrons huddled around the tables, nervously sipping whiskey and muttering quietly amongst themselves. The barkeep, a squat man with a round face and graying hair, stood behind the bar, wiping down a glass. He looked up when Reuben and Jackson entered, his expression hardening slightly before he cleared his throat. "Well, looks like you handled things," the barkeep said, his voice rough. "What now?" Reuben stopped just inside the doorway, his eyes sweeping across the room. The patrons, a mix of locals and travelers, watched him closely. They had seen the chaos that had erupted outside, and now they were waiting for direction. Some of them had no doubt heard the gunshots, and some had probably even seen the Black River Gang's riders as they arrived in town. What they needed now was assurance that Dry Creek wasn't finished, that it wasn't going to be swallowed up by the same darkness that had claimed so many other towns in the West. "We clean up," Reuben said quietly, his voice steady. "Make sure no one else is coming. This town's under my protection now." Jackson stepped forward, taking up a place beside Reuben at the bar. The barkeep didn't seem bothered by Jackson's presence, but the way he looked at him, like he was trying to remember where he'd seen him before, spoke volumes. Jackson was a man of the past, too, a man who had been around long enough to know just how thin the line was between the law and lawlessness. "Then we get to work," Jackson said, his voice calm, but there was an edge to it. He was always ready for whatever came next, and tonight was no different. "We'll need every gun in town on our side, or this won't be the last time we see trouble." Reuben nodded, glancing at the bartender. "Get the word out. We need to rally the men. There's more coming and we need to be ready." The barkeep nodded, a grim look in his eyes. "I'll spread the word," he said. "But you know how it goes in these parts. People have seen enough blood to last a lifetime. Don't know if they'll stand with you." Reuben turned back to Jackson. "Then we'll make sure they do." The hours that followed were a blur of movement and tense silence. Reuben and Jackson organized the town's men into groups, those willing to fight, and those who preferred to keep their heads down. Word had spread fast, as it always did in small towns, and soon a dozen men had gathered in the saloon. Some were old hands, men who had seen their share of gunfights and brawls in the past. Others were younger, eager to prove themselves. Reuben took the lead, his voice steady and authoritative as he outlined the plan. He spoke of the Black River Gang's reach, of their past actions in towns just like this one. He reminded the men that Dry Creek had survived before, and it would survive again, but only if they stood together. There was no room for hesitation, not anymore. By the time the meeting broke up, the town was bracing for the next wave of violence. The men were stationed in strategic positions, watching the roads, the hills, and the main street. Reuben knew that the Black River Gang wouldn't give up so easily. They'd be back, and they would come for vengeance. That night, Reuben stood at the edge of town, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The stars overhead seemed distant, cold, and unreachable. He was used to that feeling, the feeling of being too far from home, too far from peace. And yet Dry Creek was his now. He would fight for it, even if it meant tearing down everything he had built to protect it. Jackson stood next to him, his vigor silent in the darkness. He didn't need to say anything. Neither of them did. They both knew what was coming, and they both knew that their pasts, no matter how much they had tried to bury them, would come calling again. "Tomorrow," Reuben said, breaking the silence, "we fight. And this time, We don't stop until it's finished." Jackson didn't respond, but the subtle nod he gave was enough. The darkness around them seemed to grow thicker, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for the violence to come. Reuben could feel it too, the storm that was about to break. But this time, he wasn't running. This time, he was ready. The night stretched long and heavy over Dry Creek, the quiet broken only by the occasional gust of wind sweeping through the streets. The stars overhead were clear, a blanket of cold, distant lights casting a pale glow on the town's dirt roads and weathered buildings. Reuben stood still, his back to the wind, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Every muscle in his body was wound tight, ready for whatever would come next. The Black River Gang would return, he knew that. But now Dry Creek had something they hadn't counted on, unity, and Reuben had something else they hadn't expected, a plan. He wasn't a man who liked to wait, but that was all they could do for now. The town was set, the men had their orders, the streets were being watched. All they needed was the signal, the first sign that the Black River Gang was making its move. Jackson had stayed with him by the outskirts of town, both of them standing silent in the night. There was no need for words. The calm before the storm felt thick enough. Reuben could sense Jackson's restlessness, but it wasn't something they talked about anymore. Both of them had their reasons for doing this, but they didn't need to share those reasons tonight. The work was all that mattered now. The crackle of hooves in the distance snapped Reuben out of his thoughts. His body went rigid. Jackson's head whipped toward the sound, his hand instinctively reaching for his revolver. The sound was unmistakable. A group of riders coming fast. "Here they come," Reuben muttered under his breath, turning toward Jackson. His expression was hard, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. This was it. The time for waiting was over. Jackson didn't answer, but his face was set in stone. His eyes narrowed with determination. They had no more time for hesitation. The town was about to be tested, and everything depended on how they stood now. They couldn't afford to falter. The riders came into view just as the last remnants of light disappeared from the sky. There were 5 of them, each one riding hard, kicking up dust as they approached. The leader was at the front, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing the same dark coat as before. His face was grim, and his eyes locked on Reuben with a predatory gleam. The Black River Gang had come for blood. Reuben could see that in the way they held their guns, in the way they moved with purpose. These weren't just some outlaws, they were a well-oiled machine. The other riders fanned out, taking positions along the street as the leader dismounted with a fluid grace. He wasn't scared. He was confident. But he didn't know Dry Creek, not like Reuben did. "We've come to finish what we started," the leader called, his voice carrying across the silent town. His words echoed off the buildings as if the whole place was holding its breath. Reuben didn't move. He didn't need to. He had prepared for this moment, and now was the time to see if it would pay off. "Then come get it," Reuben said, his voice low but firm. "But know this. You're not going to walk away from here." The leader's lips curled into a grin, but there was a coldness behind it, an understanding that this was no longer a simple robbery or land grab. They were here for a fight, and they would get it. The leader's hand dropped to his side where his revolver hung, and he took a step forward. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice dripping with menace. With a single, sudden motion, the leader drew his gun. Reuben's hand was already moving, his own revolver in a blur of motion, but just as the leader's hand came up, Jackson's shot rang out first. The sound was deafening, a sharp crack that shattered the stillness of the night. The bullet struck the leader's arm, sending him stumbling back with a shout of pain. His gun flew from his hand, clattering on the ground as he fell. The Black River Gang was momentarily stunned, their leader down and disarmed. But they were fast, and they weren't about to let that stop them. The remaining riders drew their Weapons. The fight breaking out in an instant. Reuben's revolver was already in his hand, and his first shot rang out, sending one of the riders crashing to the ground. The others scattered, seeking cover behind buildings and wagons. They weren't going down easy, and Reuben knew this wasn't going to be over quickly. Jackson moved, his aim true, his gunfire steady and precise. He picked off another rider as he tried to make a move, his bullet sending the outlaw to the dirt. The remaining 3 riders were now pinned down, taking cover, trying to regroup. But Reuben and Jackson didn't give them a chance. "Push forward!" Reuben yelled to the men in Dry Creek. The town's defenders had been waiting for the signal, and now they sprang into action. There was no more running. The battle was here, and they weren't going to let the Black River Gang have another. Moment of control. Shots rang out from all sides now, the sound of gunfire mixed with the cries of the dying, the air thick with smoke and dust. Reuben's heart raced as his eyes scanned the street, watching for movement. The fight was chaos, but it was the kind of chaos he had always known. The kind of chaos that meant survival was just another word for luck. But there was no luck here. Not for the Black River Gang. They were losing ground quickly. The men of Dry Creek were fighting back with everything they had, and Reuben knew that as long as they stood together, they had a chance. One of the riders, desperate to escape, bolted for his horse. But Reuben was quicker. His gunshot echoed through the night, and the rider dropped before he could reach his mount. Only 2 remained now, the others either dead or wounded. The fight was almost over, and Reuben could feel it. The leader of the Black River Gang was still on the ground, clutching his injured arm, his face twisted in pain and anger. But he wasn't. He finished yet. He still had one more card to play. Reuben stepped forward, his revolver trained on the gang leader. "You had your chance," he said coldly, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Now you'll pay for everything you've done." But just as he was about to pull the trigger, a shot rang out, loud, sharp, and unexpected. Reuben's world spun as he felt a searing pain in his side. The force of the bullet knocked him off balance, and he stumbled, but his instincts kicked in. He twisted, bringing his gun up, but Jackson was already there. His shot rang out before Reuben even had a chance to respond. The last rider dropped to the ground, his gun still smoking in his hand. Reuben's breath came in sharp gasps as he looked down at the wound in his side. Blood was staining his shirt, but he didn't feel it. He didn't feel the pain, not yet. Jackson moved quickly, his hands already pulling Reuben toward cover. "You're not dying on me, partner," Jackson said, his voice calm, but with a hint of urgency. "Come on, we've got more to clean up." Reuben nodded weakly, his vision blurring slightly. But as the fight came to an end, and the sound of the last gunshots faded into the night, Reuben knew one thing for sure. Dry Creek was still standing, and so was he. The night was silent, save for the soft wind rustling through the trees, the distant rumble of the river, and the fading echoes of the gunfight that had just ended. The streets of Dry Creek were littered with the aftermath. Bodies of the Black River Gang sprawled across the dirt, their lifeless forms testament to the violence that had come for this town. And yet, despite the carnage, the survivors were still standing. The fight wasn't over, but Dry Creek had held its ground. And for the first time in a long while, Reuben Hale allowed himself a moment of relief. Reuben sat on a crate near the saloon, his side still throbbing from the bullet wound. His shirt was stained dark with blood, but the pain had dulled to a low, persistent ache. He had been through worse, and he would be through worse again. But not tonight. Tonight, he could afford to rest. Jackson had left him for a moment to check on the townsfolk, making sure everyone was accounted for, making sure no one else needed his help. The sound of boots on the dirt roads was familiar to Reuben now, a comforting constant in a world where nothing stayed the same for long. Jackson's footsteps grew louder, and Reuben looked up to see him coming back down the street, a grim look on his face, but something softer too. "We've got some wounded," Jackson said, his voice low. But we're gonna make it. The town's standing." Reuben gave a nod, not trusting his voice just yet. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving him with the weight of what had happened. The pain, the violence, the death. It wasn't over. Not yet. But the Black River Gang had been stopped, at least for now, and Dry Creek had survived. Jackson squatted down beside him, his eyes scanning the horizon. "You were right," he said quietly. "We made a stand. We took 'em down. But there's more out there, Reuben. This wasn't the end of it, it's just the beginning." Reuben's gaze turned toward the horizon as well, the once warm glow of the sunset now fading into the cool twilight of evening. The night was coming, and with it, the uncertain future. "I know," Reuben said softly. "It'll never be over. The West, it doesn't stop, but we've given this place a chance, we've given these people a chance. That's what matters." Jackson looked at him for a long moment, the weight of his words settling in. There was no grand gesture, no sweeping declaration, just two men who had seen enough bloodshed to know that sometimes all you could do was fight. Sometimes the only thing left was to survive. And Dry Creek had survived. The wind picked up again, rustling the trees along the street, and Reuben took a deep breath. His side was still burning with pain, but it wasn't enough to stop him. It would heal, just like everything else had. Over a time, the people of Dry Creek would rebuild. They would heal too, and maybe, just maybe, this place would become something better, something stronger. Jackson stood, looking down at him, and then he extended a hand. "You ready for the next one?" Reuben looked at his hand, the same hand that had once drawn a gun faster than a man could blink. He took it, pulling himself up, the effort sharp, but not impossible. "I'm always ready, Jackson," he said, his voice steady despite the pain. "But we're doing this on our terms, not theirs." Jackson's lips curled slightly, and the faintest glimmer of something resembling a smile flickered in his eyes. "You've got a way of seeing things through, Reuben. I'll give you that." Reuben smiled back, though it was brief. There was no celebration in it, no joy, just the quiet understanding between two men who had fought too many battles to count and knew that victory was never certain. It was only a fleeting thing, a brief moment where the world seemed to be on their side. Together, they walked through the streets of Dry Creek. The people had begun to emerge from their homes, their faces wary but relieved. They had seen the carnage, heard the shots, but now they were seeing something else, a chance, a future. Dry Creek was still standing. The town had paid a price, but it had held on. And that was something. In the distance, Reuben could hear the sounds of the horses that had come with the Black River Gang. He knew that there were still many more threats out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for their moment to strike. But tonight, there was peace. A temporary peace, perhaps, but it was peace all the same. Reuben stopped at the edge of the town, looking out at the vast, untamed land that stretched out before him. The West was unforgiving, but it was also a place where men could carve out something of their own if they were strong enough. And for tonight, that was enough. "Tomorrow, we'll clean up the mess," Reuben said, his voice low as he gazed. Out at the horizon, Jackson nodded, his eyes following Reuben's gaze. "And then we move on, but for now, we've won." Reuben didn't answer immediately. He simply stood there, taking in the view. The sky was darkening, and the town of Dry Creek was growing quiet. But in his heart, Reuben knew this wouldn't be the end of the fight. It never was. As long as the West stood, there would always be another battle, another fight, another chance to protect the ones you loved, or to watch them fall. But tonight, for once, the West had lost, and that made all the difference. And so, the town of Dry Creek remained, scarred but unbroken. Reuben Hale and Jackson Carter, two men bound by a past neither of them could escape, walked into the uncertain future side by side. The road ahead was as wild as the land itself, but For the first time in years, Reuben felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps this time, it would be different. The West had claimed many lives, but tonight it had failed to claim this one. And for Reuben Hale, that was enough. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share and subscribe to our YouTube channel, where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow for another special story.